episode of the Special Topics Newscast, your number one trusted source for topics
that are special.
As you may already know, my name is Chris Marchio, and this is my co-host Justin Curia. We've been working in the sport field for over 40 years, respectively, and we want to bring our many, many decades of knowledge to the world.
Today's episode is going to revolve around Indigenous sport. Some of you already know Indigenous sport is a topic that isn't touched on very often. It's something that we wanted to shed some light on. The Indigenous community has faced a lot of hardships over the years, as we all know, and we feel like we can provide some sort of solutions to help improve their situation in the sport field.
So during today's episode, you'll get the chance to hear from some of our colleagues who are experts in the sporting world. Our first guest is going to be Thompson, who has worked in the Indigenous sport community for over 15 years. He's going to give us a brief overview of some of the current issues the Indigenous sport community is currently facing. Hey Ian, care to touch on some of the topics?
Chris, Justin, thanks guys. So we're going to learn a little bit about how the government of Canada is responding to Truth and Reconciliation's Commission's calls to action. So the first call to action, we're going to call upon all levels of government in collaboration with Aboriginal People's Sports Halls of Fame and also other relevant organizations, basically to provide public education that tells the history of Aboriginal athletes. The second call to action, we're going to call upon all government levels to take action to ensure long-term athlete development, as well as growth and continued support for the North American Indigenous Games, and also as funding to host the Games and preparation and travel. The third call to action, we're going to call upon the federal government to amend the Physical Activity and Sport Act to support reconciliation by ensuring that policies to promote physical activity as a fundamental element of health and well-being, reduce participation barriers, and increase the excellence in the Canadian sports system. The fourth call to action, we're going to call upon the federal government to ensure that the national sports policies, programs, and initiatives are inclusive of Aboriginal people, so including but not limited to creating stable funding for community sports programs that reflect the diverse cultures and traditional sporting activities of Aboriginal peoples, an elite athlete development program, programs for coaches, trainers, and sports officials, as well as anti-racism awareness training programs. The fifth and final call to action, we're going to call upon officials and host countries of international sporting event to basically ensure that Indigenous people's territorial protocols are respected and communities are engaged in all aspects of planning and participating. I'm going to send it back over to Chris and Justin.
Thanks for the call, Ian. We really appreciate your input on this topic. Your points really address the current issues the Indigenous community is facing, and hopefully our listeners learn something from it. Next up, we have our government expert, Andy Wilson, calling in. Andy actually has over 45 years of experience working in government sport, all the way from municipal government up to federal. He's going to elaborate and provide some in-depth discussion on those issues Ian briefly spoke about. Hey Andy, how's it going?
Thanks, guys. I'm going to briefly go over some of the improvements and some of the changes that have been made since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has come out with their findings. The first major change we found was in 2017, the Tom Longboat Awards were relaunched. These awards are incredibly important for Indigenous communities in Canada. They showcase and highlight the top Indigenous athletes for that year. And most importantly, I think in 2017, the two winning athletes were also honored at the Canadian Hall of Fame sporting ceremony as well, to ensure that this wasn't just an Indigenous athlete success. This really was an Indigenous Canadian athlete success, and to show that this isn't just selected and kept in one community, that this is seen on a broader stage. The second big improvement was with the 2017 federal budget. The first big change was allocation of $18.9 million over the first 5 years. and then $5.5 million subsequently every 4 years after that. This federal money was earmarked to help improve 4 main areas related to Indigenous sport. The first area is obviously Indigenous sport leadership. I think it's important for people, and especially youth in underserved communities, to be able to see members of their own community succeed and thrive in leadership positions. And so it's important that this money, in part, help train, help qualify, and help provide equipment and funding to aspiring Indigenous sport leaders to be able to then go out and help their communities. The second area of improvement is with culturally relevant sport programming. So this can be kind of one of two ways, really. This can be traditional sporting programming, or it can be non-traditional sporting programming with a traditional twist or ceremony or rule change involved. It's important that Indigenous sport isn't seen as just one thing or just one activity. Indigenous sport is really anything that involves Indigenous people, whether it's football or whether it's traditional games that have been played for centuries. The third area of improvement is with funding to provide the North American Indigenous Games and participation in the NAG Games. This is obviously a huge stage for Indigenous athletes to be able to go out and perform, to put their communities on a map, to make their communities proud, to make themselves proud, and continued involvement and funding in those games is incredibly important for Indigenous sport. And finally, the fourth area for funding is with Sport Canada's continued ongoing data and research in terms of participation and how funding and increased funding and maybe different areas of funding can help grow and make Indigenous sport thrive. Finally, the third major change that we've seen is that Sport Canada has mandated reviews into past Indigenous engagement in major Canadian sporting events. This is most notably to go over Indigenous engagement in the Vancouver Olympics and in the Toronto Parapan and Pan Am Games. There was some criticism with the lack of some Indigenous communities, local Indigenous communities, and how they were met with, and lack of dialogue in some cases. And it's important that whenever we do host major sporting events, that we open dialogue, we have meetings with local Indigenous communities, and ensure that they remain an important part of the events that go on. Finally, something that has begun and needs to continue and expand in the future is increased dialogue and increased meetings with the federal government and between Indigenous communities and Indigenous sporting leaders. Given the long-term nature of these improvements, this isn't something that can be fixed overnight. And so it's incredibly vital that there's always open dialogue between the Indigenous leaders and their communities, as well as the federal government, to ensure that money is going towards causes that'll make a great effort, that it's going towards needed causes, that it's being used in a good way for these communities, and that this isn't just a one-time move, that this funding and this engagement can be continued for many years to come. So thanks, guys, and back to you.
We really appreciate that call, Andy. Super informative, and you gave us a deep understanding of what's going on. Now, Justin, what do you think the government can do to help with the issues that Andy and Ian spoke about?
Well, first off, Chris, I feel like if the government provided, some more funding and maybe some more grassroots sport opportunities for Indigenous youth, that'd be a great start, obviously. Making sport more accessible to the Indigenous communities can also really get the ball rolling and solving some of the issues.
Yeah, for sure. And something else to think about would be even Hall of Fame recognition.
Yeah.
I know the Tom Longboat Awards are given out every year,
Yeah.
but other than that, there's very few opportunities for the Indigenous sport community to be recognized.
It's very true. I agree with that 100%, Chris. I just kind of go back and reiterate on what Andy was saying earlier. Funding for programs that highlight Indigenous sporting activities would definitely help out. Bringing light to our country's cultural roots might even help create more of an awareness and respect to our country's Indigenous background too.
For sure, for sure. So that concludes today's episode. This is a topic that seems to be swept under the rug, and through this experience, myself and Justin, we learned a lot about the issues facing the Indigenous community in the sport world, and we hope you did too. Join us next week when we talk about fundraising and institutional giving with our special guest, Richard Kroll.